Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to round 2 of our Worlds Collide tournament. This time we're going to have Gameslayer, the Spin Cycle, Blues, and Heisenberg. Gameslayer and Heisenberg are going to be our representatives of the old world, while Blues and the Spin Cycle are going to be playing for the new. So, different map from last time, not as much carbon available, still definitely could drop Scavenger in this area though, with easy access to water, a cliff, and aluminum. It's not great, but it is doable if somebody would like it. Plenty of aluminum and iron elsewhere on the map. Nice big patch of iron. Gameslayer not going to find anywhere near any of these locations, and instead take Scavenger near the silicon because, of course, there's none of that left on the map. This is a very, very interesting decision from Gameslayer, and it means we are going to have a different sort of game this time. Now, a long time ago, when some people initially started playing in early access, it was the case that when there were no tiles left on the map of a particular resource, an auction was kind of likely to occur that would add another of that resource. But eventually it was determined that acquiring a monopoly was such a commitment that it was valuable and should be kept as a monopoly. And so that's what Gameslayer has managed to establish himself. The only way anybody else is going to get access to Silicon in this game is going to be with mutinies for a short time or slant drilling. No underground nukes available to knock this down, but of course it is Silicon. And this was a very, very heavy investment into it by Gameslayer. However, what I think is going to work in his favor is, despite the fact that there are no warehouses up, there is a $160 starting glass price. Glass started very expensive. So he can transition this Silicon into glass kilns very easily for himself in order to make that early money that he needs in order to keep upgrading, and then from there he'll likely be able to push through the rest of the game, having control of that market. Now Gameslayer is going to have to be very careful that he actually uses this monopoly as it stands. He may want to consider getting slant drilling in order to secure the monopoly completely, and he's likely going to want a tool like a hacker array in order to abuse glass and silicon prices late in the game. On top of that, he's going to want to make sure not to sell down too much carbon if he could avoid it, so as to not encourage things like wind turbines coming up and try and force people more toward solar panels. But unfortunately, with 11 geotherms down and another carbon using scavenger, that is going to be a bit difficult to pull off this game. So it's likely that late area that he needs to be focused on the most. Let's see. Goon Squad caught an EMP attempt. It's a good attempt at an EMP, but the Goon Squad catching it, that's not going to be pleasant for the Spin Cycle, who got pointed out as the aggressor. And we'll have to see if Gameslayer is feeling vindictive, or if he'd rather just hold on to that for now and watch for something like Blues putting down this glass kiln and put a stop to that in order to keep the market as his for the time being.
A scavenger HQ has been upgraded.
Yep. Our scavengers pushing to HQ level 3 quickly. No big surprise. Heisenberg is going to get there a little bit ahead of Gameslayer, likely due to the fact that he took actual aluminum and carbon tiles. Didn't have to worry about, for example, buying Goon Squads so much. Didn't have to worry about buying and selling resources. Just was able to very easily and quickly acquire all those upgrade resources he need, and then once he had bought that glass, made it easier for Gameslayer to sell glass down in order to pick up the aluminum that he required, as an example. So, claim auction, pretty basic, pretty simple, a little cheap at 10,000. Yeah, not going to quite let that go. Gameslayer doesn't really want this, but he couldn't let it go for 10,000. That was ridiculously cheap. He's unlikely to push to 16, but apparently he's going to. Blues willing to push it to 18. That's the kind of thing Gameslayer's probably going to be happy to see. 18, 20, that's far more reasonable for a claim auction. I'm a little surprised Blues is pushing this hard for it. He may be feeling a little bit behind. He may just want to be able to add a friend to his glass kiln. As we all know, a single secondary building, not really particularly effective. He'd much rather have that pair and those efficiency bonuses going in his direction. Gameslayer is going to have to be watching out for this and making sure not to sell down Silicon unless he absolutely has to, so as to encourage Blues to move out of that market. And in fact, we do see an EMP, likely that EMP of Gameslayer's that he intercepted earlier this game. landing on the glass kilns. Doesn't want anybody else in that market. Just tells Blues that he can get out of here. This isn't his territory. Gameslayer has also managed to move into a triangle of food, getting started just now, along with the spin cycle. That's going to be a very valuable market, but Heisenberg also already in it. Food getting expensive very quickly this game. There's no robots on the field, lots of life support consumption going on. It's going to be pushing that price up along with all these habitats. But of course, with everybody in that market, one can expect it to start dropping pretty rapidly, especially with the trio of farms from Spin Cycle and Gameslayer. And Blues is going to have to be looking elsewhere for what market he would like to get into. Potentially, it could just be power out of Blues. We'll have to see exactly what he can move into, assuming he can push to HQ level 3 anytime soon. Blues does seem to be struggling a bit this game. He did not seem to get the better of steel this time around. He's trying to make glass. He's been blocked from that. Silicon's getting expensive as Gameslayer isn't collecting it and is using it to put down solar panels. He can always transition back into 2 silicon tiles if he would like to at some point, if silicon starts getting excessively expensive. But for now, as long as he can make the glass, as long as he can pull in some silicon, he's happy to let that price increase and discourage everybody else from that glass market. Blue's really looking to be in a lot of trouble. He has been forced to transition out of his steel and into reactors, not something you necessarily want to do when you're in a C level of debt, C bond rating. Thankfully, he does manage to push that back up to a B with his upgrade, giving him so much more of an assets advantage that it offsets the debt a little bit more effectively. And the electrolysis reactors are going to be pretty strong, but Blues is definitely going to have to be keeping an eye on that debt meter after the 24,000 auction that he picked up. Also going to be moving into chem refineries. Definitely a decision that I like since he's already gone into the reactors. Chemicals are already starting to get expensive. There is a laboratory down, and we do expect to see buildings such as patent labs start to come up soon now that we've got some level 4 players. That's usually about when you'll see the patent labs, and potentially also optimization centers come online to get that tech researched. And so I like this decision from Blues. It's a decent way to try and pull himself back into the game. He'll just have to keep an eye on that steel price, potentially transition out of these glass kilns and on into steel as this silicon price continues to go up. You can see already that our food players are mostly hurting with that resource now, not making a whole lot of money. Gameslayer is going to be the only player to actively transition out of the food for the time being. And for the same reason that I liked Blue's transition into chems, I like Gameslayer's transition. Already plenty of reactors online. Fuel is dropping pretty effectively. He actually has some carbon to kind of support this decision. And he'll be able to make a fair amount of money in these chems before they fall out completely. But of course, no actual chemical consumption has started, which is going to be some pushback against that. And meanwhile, Heisenberg, he's just managed to, with his very, very simple upgrades, he got into that scavenger position we talked about earlier, where it was kind of like mediocre tiles, but it was a lot of them with water, carbon, and aluminum all just right next to each other. He's managed to use that very effectively to simply push to HQ5 quickly. He'll need to look at what he can do to actually end this game. Now that he's gotten here, it does look like it's going to be... Right now, he's got a pleasure dome going up, which should be fine. It gets frozen pretty much the moment it lands, but that's all right. Not going to be too concerned over it. And we would expect to see something else coming out of him. Is he going to push to an off-world market? We haven't really checked prices and how strong they are. They're okay this game. Not super amazing, but decent. Is he going to try and get into some tech so that he can get electronics production started? Given that we had all of these machine shops down early this game. We've had 5 machine shops since the start of the game, I do believe. And we've had a 6th added at some point. So that is definitely a market to be looking at, especially with these pleasure domes dropping, with everybody else going to be looking into optimization centers, potentially hack arrays and off-world markets. Always, and even the patent lab these days costing electronics, of course. Always got to be looking out for that potential transition into electronics production. Optimization center auction should be exactly the kind of thing Heisenberg is looking for. He's got a very healthy bond rating, very, very small amount of debt. This is worth a lot of money. You can see it costs $12,000 just to build an optimization center for him right now. So getting an extra claim attached to it for basically another $12,000 is absolutely fantastic. It's also positioned great. And on top of that, one thing that people don't count on with these auctions all the time is just the sheer build time reduction of getting that in place, right? Let's say he had to buy the claim. Like, he could have done it. He could have bought the claim and then sent the building out. But think about all that construction time, all that travel time. None of that's there. Heisenberg's just instantly granted a late game building that he absolutely needed to be transitioning into at this point. Heisenberg has also gotten up a patent lab with, I believe, our only hologram of the game thus far. And he is going to be working away at virtual reality. Of course, Spin Cycle has had that patent lab up for a fair amount of time now, being pretty effective. He's managed to get perpetual motion and slant drilling, so Spin Cycle is going to be breaking that silicon monopoly that Gameslayer was hoping to exploit. We'll just have to see how Gameslayer responds to that. Mutinies could be effective against it, but that's about it. EMPs you don't really want to use. Pirates also have some potential here to slow down the invasion, and of course Spin Cycle, he could add another tile to this and get up to 6 silicon a second, but that's unlikely, so Gameslayer still definitely has the advantage in that area moving forward. Heisenberg and sends Spin Cycle with some aggressive stock purchases onto Gameslayer. Don't know if that's what they're going to want to be doing, given that Gameslayer has managed to secure all of his stock and pushed HQ5 at this point. Now it's going to be time to be watching for what Gameslayer's late game plan is going to be. 3 Pleasure Domes up this game, very, very different from the last game, where we only saw one player build a Pleasure Dome for a very long period of time. No virtual reality picked up. No, Heisenberg has virtual reality. Picked that up not too long ago. And so he is going to have a small advantage in that Pleasure Dome. You can see that everybody has double adjacency, but Heisenberg netting just a bit more cash from it. Of course, power being so expensive, you're basically just churning debt into money, but that's still all right for the Pleasure Dome, frankly, and these players are going to be okay leaving them on despite the high power cost. Heisenberg wanted to be making sure that he keeps using this optimization center. It's not all that expensive, and of course there are definitely going to be some decent techs to upgrade, in particular electronics. Certainly something I think all of our players need to be looking at, especially now that Spin Cycle has kind of broken that Gameslayer monopoly. It means silicon is unlikely to get excessively out of control, and electronics become far more valuable. Big error from all of our players there. An $8,000 claim auction is way, way too cheap. Even at this stage of the game, we're already to Sol 5, so the auction becomes a claim auction. Let's just clarify. Becomes less valuable as the game goes on, right? Because it's going to be useful for a smaller period of time. So claim auctions actually drop in value as the game goes on, just like pretty much anything. Everything is always consistently losing value. Always. But 8,000 is still really, really cheap. We're talking about 8,000 debt even. That's potentially just free money when you only had about 30,000 debt, maybe 40,000 debt as Heisenberg at that moment. He's already paying off debt fantastically with his power production in these wind turbines. There's a dust storm on the way too to help out with that. That's going to be just great for Heisenberg. He's going to be in a very, very strong position here in terms of his debt payments. So that's just a fantastic, fantastic pickup for him. You never want to let a claim auction go that cheap unless the game is literally about to end, pretty much. Well, Carbon looking very, very nice for Heisenberg. And this is something that could be expected this game for him that's also been going in his favor. Gameslayer, the downside to his found location is he was only operating on a 3 carbon per second, right? Just 2 low tiles. And that's really not enough, period. It's just not going to get the job done as a scavenger. He's been having to purchase large amounts of it. Other people have been consuming it to get into the electronics market, to get into the chems market. That could all have been expected based on the chemical starting price and the massive number of machine shops at the start of the game. So all that pressure has given Heisenberg a really fantastic advantage. You can see that he's managed to push to an off-world market successfully because of all this excess carbon that he has. He's managed to develop a massive stockpile of very, very valuable carbon with this adrenaline boost. Now, he could crash this price at any moment, but the other thing he can do is pretty easily push into another off-world market without too much trouble. His has been stolen away, so that's something he'll have to watch out for. Blue's seeing through that hologram with a spy. Says, nope, got my eye on you. You're not going to get that. So Heisenberg, he's going to have to do something with this. Just having a massive stockpile of carbon in and of itself doesn't do very much, and he's going to want to sell it down before Gameslayer manages to ramp up his own carbon production. These electronics factories still making a massive amount of money despite all this. So Heisenberg, I really want to see that second off-world from him. That's exactly what we do see, in fact. Looks like he's also sold a fair amount of that carbon, knocked that price down. All of our electronics producers are going to be super, super happy about that. And Heisenberg, I really don't like the fact that he hasn't pushed into electronics at any point this game. He had the advantage when it came to electronics production, especially once Spin Cycle picked up slant drilling. Electronics production could have been his. He could have upgraded it quickly. He could have cut that market away from everybody else, taken control of it, had most of the carbon in the game. I mean, Gameslayer isn't collecting enough carbon to make up for his consumption, or wasn't, until he's gotten it upgraded very, very heavily. He was losing carbon until just a moment ago. So Heisenberg could have had control of that market for a long time, and he's just never moved into it, and I'd say that's a pretty distinct mistake, but he still has managed to do enough with the advantage that he likely won't be seriously punished for it. I mean, he's gotten to two off-world markets already. Nobody else, I think, has even started one. Oh, no, we do have one just begun, not just begun, almost done. From the Spin Cycle. Holograms make all this difficult to interpret sometimes, because I have to bounce back and forth between all the players. But Spin Cycle, okay, he has an off-world market, but he's still stuck back on HQ level 5, and that's an expansive player. He could hit he's stuck back on HQ 4. He could hit 5 very, very soon, if he wants to. He could simply try and push for another no, he can't push for another off-world market. He's still HQ 4. He could push into some upgrade centers. He could push into a hack array. He's got some options, and of course he has 2 off-worlds at the moment because everybody's fighting over both of Heisenberg's off-worlds. But Heisenberg, once again, such a massive advantage, mostly I believe on the back of those quick upgrades into that carbon market with just continued simple production of life support that he never had to transition out of because he kept upgrading so rapidly. He set himself up into a pretty nice position overall. Gameslayer, that Silicon monopoly has just never worked out for him this game. Silicon never got too expensive. There was never a huge amount of pressure on it. Especially because solar panels weren't highly valuable this game like they might have been. Steel price stayed low, plenty of geotherms available, wind turbines available for our scavenger player very, very easily. And so Spin Cycle being able to come in and break that monopoly before Gameslayer actually did anything with it, I think this found wasn't very well used and maybe wasn't that well thought out moving into the start of this game. He took that pretty early, sacrificed any potential claims advantage, and it was definitely a mediocre to poor position, excluding the silicon that was there, and that's just never paid out this game. Now, if we look at stock, everybody has secured at least the 5 they need to guarantee no majorities this game, but Heisenberg, with, once again, this is an area where he has the clear advantage. He's secured 10 of his own stock. That's absolutely fantastic, having all that available. And this is despite the fact, by the way, that he's continuing to have his off-world markets mutinied, taken away from him, having to intercept mutinies, trying to just hold on to them this whole time. He gets 10 of his own stock, and he's pushed 3 into blues, seeing blues as the primary threat this game, and I think he's exactly correct about that. Blues has a hologrammed off-world down. I don't know how much of this Heisenberg has been paying attention to. He doesn't have spies in position, at minimum, to know about Blue's off-worlds, but he can maybe make an educated guess based on where Steel is this game, the fact that Spin Cycle hasn't upgraded yet, all kinds of little details that you can kind of interpret. Yeah, that's probably an off-world market location. For example, this third metal mine, maybe he's got that iron. Maybe. But maybe he really doesn't. So Heisenberg identifies very correctly, I think, that Blues is the danger. Blues also is the one with the optimization centers down, which is always something you have to consider. Who has the better optimizations? Now, GameSlayer has optimization centers down as well.
Let this be a lesson to you all.
But GameSlayer's stock price is looking kind of weak. He's going to have to be concerned about that long term. He's got wasted tiles in this silicon. Everything's looking just a bit more awkward for him. And on top of that, he's scavenger rather than expansive. And the remaining black market this game doesn't look great for a scavenger. So he's a little bit less of a danger because Blues just has more tiles, and that also makes Blues more rewarding to pick up. The fact that he has so many more tiles from being expansive, from the auctions that he picked up, all kinds of these little details just kind of push Heisenberg in a Blues direction. Meanwhile, Spin Cycle, he has managed to push to 5 fairly recently, but he still isn't looking like much of a threat. He has a fair amount of money, and that's the scary part about him, is if he wants to swing in and swing this before Heisenberg can finish it, that's going to be a problem for Heisenberg. But Heisenberg's stock price is so high that he's hoping he doesn't have to worry about that. And we'll just have to see how things move forward from here. On top of that, I mean, Heisenberg, even if he were to be purchased by Spin Cycle, it would cost such an extreme amount of money that it seems unlikely. So we'll just have to see if Heisenberg can hold on to his Offworlds long enough to push to this Blues buyout before the Spin Cycle becomes a true threat to him. Spin Cycle is very effectively making money at this point. Steel mills coming down are going to be great. Chemical refineries are also going to be great. We've got pirates down, stealing some water, it looks like. That's just fine. I still hate that pirate noise in my headphones. I'm never going to get over it. It's a lot better than it used to be when it was just blaring, but now it's just like this annoying tick of static. And the big thing that Spin Cycle has going for him, of course, is this patent lab. Slant drilling, thinking machines, carbon strumming, nanotech, perpetual motion, water engine, superconductor. That is a ridiculous number of patents. That's managing to keep him okay in terms of debt pretty easily because his power costs are so low and he has so much power production during the day. The nanotech allows for great transitions if steel gets expensive, which it did for a while. Now we're looking to be in a different situation. So he is definitely turning into a threat and has the potential to be one now, but Blues was the more immediate and obvious problem for Heisenberg. Heisenberg is going to manage to get to that Blues purchased, so he has 2 territories for himself, basically. But on top of that, Spin Cycle and GameSlayer are starting to get into it, and this is exactly what Heisenberg wants to see right now. He wants to see these 2 players fighting, not being a threat to him, not causing a problem. This just lets Heisenberg kind of solidify his position. He has a moment to think, he has a moment to breathe. And more than that, he has time to let Blues as a subsidiary start ramping up huge amounts of income off these off-world launches. Blues is already worth almost $60 a share, and Heisenberg has all 10 shares. That's fantastic. He has those secured for the duration of his time in this game. On top of that, Blues has double off-worlds launching. So watch this as these off-worlds launch. So watch, we went from like 60 to now 160 is what we're sitting at for income. And that's just going to keep rising as time goes on. Heisenberg already making $1,600 a second from this. Heisenberg did choose to get involved a little bit in the early stock purchasing. This just pushes his price a little bit higher. But I think when Spin Cycle and GameSlayer chose to get into it with each other, that almost guarantees this game for Heisenberg. It's effectively a 2v1v1, and that is never going to end up well for the 2-1s. The other thing is Heisenberg secured a very strong opponent in Blues. Blues had a decent number of upgrades, the double off-world, those are all fantastic, the large amount of territory. All of this continues working in Heisenberg's favor. Spin Cycle has managed to even things out a little bit by acquiring GameSlayer, but GameSlayer arguably less valuable than Blues, and he's not going to have control of that subsidiary for nearly the same length of time, right? GameSlayer, we can check upgrades. GameSlayer's done well in those. He's acquired a large amount of upgrades. That's good for Spin Cycle now that he's purchased them. But maybe they're in the wrong areas. 4 oxygen as opposed to 3 food, for example. Carbon as opposed to no carbon. Carbon's not all that valuable of an upgrade right now. The electronics production is fine, but he's only got 2 electronics tiles down, so it's not having that much of an influence. just as an example. Meanwhile, blues, with way more tiles and upgrades into the very important food, it starts to make a bit of a difference, right? All that said, we can see that Heisenberg, with his earlier purchase, his way more subsidiary income, his significant stock price advantage, all of this has played into his favor, where Heisenberg has acquired 5 of Spin Cycle's stock. Spin Cycle has only acquired 1 of Heisenberg's stock. And as I said before, the game basically ended the moment those two got into it with each other. Rather than going after Heisenberg, it would have been a difficult climb if they had been working together to bring down someone in such a dominant position. But now, they effectively made it impossible. So Heisenberg, with his 3,000 a second from his absolutely fantastic subsidiary in blues and his Offworld launches, we are just basically waiting for this one to finish up. Remember, once again, players are not allowed to concede, and so they will be forced to play this out all the way to the end. And Spin Cycle should likely be doing his best to hold on for as long as he can this game, due to tiebreakers and such. That's why we continue to see things like Black Market coming down, and why we continue to see stock purchases going on in order to just raise that stock price, make it harder and harder and harder for Heisenberg to finish up the game. That said, he's got the cash now and should be looking to go ahead and end it. Strong win on over to Heisenberg.